Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 5 of PSHS 6240 here at George Washington University. So I wanted to start off with a couple of announcements. Adobe Connect session, our second one, will be 9 February. We're going to do it at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I know there were some issues with it being so late. I don't think there's anybody on the West Coast that might be interfering with their work. But we're going to go ahead and just try and do it at 8 p.m. so we don't run till 10 o'clock. So that group 2 will go about, and they'll cover their WMD terrorism scenario. And everyone, again, it's optional if you want to go. It's optional for everyone else. If you are briefing, you do need to go. And I just want to say this again. If you are briefing, if you're in the group in group 2, but you can't make it, that's fine. Someone else can brief. Only 1 or 2 or 3 people need to brief. Not everyone needs to brief. But if you are one of those 1 or 2 or 3 people that are briefing, then yes, you do have to be there. And we're going to go back to Adobe Connect this time. I don't think the platform last time worked out very well, so we'll hopefully get rid of the technical issues. Paper number 2, 12 February at 11:59 p.m. Again, you'll get some comments about everyone's gotten their paper 1 marked, and please take those comments in for paper 2. And again, I'm not going to be very generous with extensions because of the short nature of this paper. And then finally, I do want to talk about the chaos this past week with the border banning the seven countries from entering the United States. I will start out by saying that, and again, full disclosure, I don't agree with it. I think it was a terrible idea. I think it was bad if you were a U.S. soldier and you relied on interpreters in Iraq that now have been blacklisted from coming into the United States. I think from a humanitarian issue, it's not good to keep kids bottled up in detention areas in our various airports. And I'm also, again, I've only heard these secondary reports, and I'm sure they've been sensationalized a bit. But if they are true, again, I don't think the borders and customs handle this with the most appropriateness. And I can't blame them too much because they got, this order came out last minute. But again, I'm not sure some of these individual cases that I've heard had humanitarian concerns to begin with. So again, I disagree with it. I don't think it kept us safe. I think it felt more in the political security theater role than it was actually stopping people from coming in. With that being said, if you're against this type of mass blanket statements or blanket bans, you have to answer these 2 questions. 1, how do we deal with visa overstays? That is a big issue. It would be a great final paper topic if you want to talk about it. But people who come in, they're here for school or here for work or here on vacation, and they get a visa and then they stay. That's an issue. How do we monitor them in a way that that we can make sure that they shouldn't be overstaying, and if they are, how do we identify them? That is something you have to, as a country, a national security perspective, we have to be able to better identify those people and be able to apply appropriate amount of scrutiny. And now the second thing is how do we scrutinize or figure out if people are going to multiple hotspots back and forth? I go to Yemen every year. Should those people deserve further scrutiny? I mean, I think so. Whether they go to Yemen, whether they go to areas surrounding Iraq and Syria, let's say they're coming in and forth, or let's say they travel there and they're there for 3 months, 6 months, and then they come back. How do we give those people further scrutiny? And if they're non-U.S. citizens, that might be a little bit easier because we can monitor them with greater alacrity. But even if they are U.S. citizens or U.S. green card holders and they're traveling back and forth to Yemen, they're traveling back and forth to areas surrounding Somalia, areas surrounding Iraq and Syria, how do we do that? How do we make sure that our local law enforcement is aware that someone who has traveled back and forth from Yemen is now living in their neighborhood? How do we monitor, again, if someone's traveling back and forth from Yemen, yeah, maybe they can be interdicted at the border, but there's only so much the Border Patrol can do, or whether it's an airport or a legitimate border area. So if they're at an airport and they've been found going back and forth to Yemen, even if they are detained, you can't detain them forever. And if they haven't committed a crime, but they're kind of, let's say they've traveled back and forth from Yemen, but their social networking implies that they're not the most friendly people to the United States, and they're U.S. citizens. What do? You can't detain them. It's a free country. You can't, I'm allowed to say some anti-American things on my social network, my social media. So the Border Patrol has to let them go at a certain point, but how do we follow up? How does local law enforcement know that that person who has been traveling multiple times to hotspots has a YouTube videos of call it whatever you want, indications of radicalization, and how do we monitor them better? So if anyone can come up with answers to those two questions, that'd be great. Final topic. We're going to go into more detail on later subjects. So paper overview. I'll be honest, everyone needs work. The biggest issue, and I wrote this multiple times, far too much background. I was really clear on not wanting history lessons, and some of you gave them to me anyway. I could tell you're trying to fill your paper up so you can meet the 1,800 word threshold. I can spot that stuff pretty well. This isn't high school. This isn't college. This is graduate level work. And if you're doing that, you probably aren't doing graduate level work. One thing to think about as you progress in your civilian careers is, no one's going to want to read. If you start a paper about, the Fort Hood shooting and you start it when Nidal Hasan was 5 years old, you've already lost your reader. And that paper is going to go in the trash, especially someone who's got to read a lot of papers. You have to economize your thoughts and economize your words. And the way I like to write, especially if I'm writing for my day job, every sentence has to earn its way onto that paper. Every sentence has to tell me something new, has to refine a point, has to be unique analysis. That is how you make your work a lot better. And I didn't see that from a whole lot of people. So again, way too much background. Again, pin your arguments to the history. Don't give me the history up front and then talk about your arguments. Go right into your arguments and talk about the history. So the historical events, if you're going to talk about Nidal Hasan, go right into, I believe he was terrorism because of 1, he showed this level of radicalization. Boom, boom, boom. 2, he communicated with a known terrorist. Boom, boom, boom. Go right into you. Don't start off with the history because that dilutes your argument. And then finally, passive voice. I think not a lot of people, or too many people, use passive voice. I always see this in my papers. So this top sentence here, the ball was bounced by the boy. And I don't want to go into a grammar exercise here, but you have the direct object, the verb, and subject. That's passive voice. And an active voice is the second sentence. You have subject, verb, direct object. So the ball was bounced by the boys, passive voice, because you're using the direct object first. Active voice, subject, verb, direct object. So that's, again, it really dilutes your argument points if you're using passive voice too much. So review of week 4, terrorism adaptation. I think some pretty good comments I saw. The one question I want to ask, and the situation is changing rapidly, but will ISIS be successful? That's a question to ask. Are there? Let me put it this way: from the stories that analyze successes, Hezbollah, Hamas, are they using the same level of variables, characteristics, response to counterterrorism pressure that would make them successful? I argue no. I think they're going into that tailspin of radicalization and criminal behavior that's going to eventually put ISIS to the dustbin of history. Others might argue otherwise, but I think those factors that we saw in those failed terrorist groups, Shinrikyo, Jemaah Islamiyah, those factors, I think, patterns benefit ISIL a lot more, or are reflective of ISIL. And then are we seeing the schisms that we talked about? Some places in ISIL, yes. Some places, no. I think maybe time will tell with a little bit more clarity. And then WMD Terrorism, again, The Dirty War, I thought was a pretty good movie. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It will hopefully inspire you to be in this program, in this line of field, more. Just a couple of points from that. The uranium that's used to actually be contaminant would be some sort of enriched uranium, not something you can just buy off the street. I think they kind of gloss over that part. So that was a key point. The other key point is I think they gloss over how to transport radioactive material, they say, from Turkey to England. It's almost done kind of haphazardly. But otherwise, I think that movie was pretty spot on. Everything from the political side, when she's testifying before Parliament, their Homeland Security equivalent director, to how the intelligence framework wrapped up, to actually how the response would be for that. The one thing I would also say is that having worked on this issue, I've talked to a lot of scientists and some first responders, and they would say instead of those cantonment areas that they set up, you would just tell everyone to just go home and decontaminate at home. Don't touch anybody, just go take your shower and destroy your clothes, instead of masses of people who can only exit through one area and are injured and are infecting each other through open wounds. So that's just a kind of a key point. Shinrikyo case study, I'm not going to go into more detail because I think the article, CNAS article, as well as the question I asked about Shinrikyo, comparing it to Al-Qaeda, and the short video that you watched, I think that told a very good story, and that hopefully will lead you into the questions, or get you thinking about paper 2 and ask the question, okay, what did Shinrikyo have that allowed them to conduct the attack? What did they didn't have? What were those variables? And that's where I'm hoping you don't have to cite Shinrikyo, but you have to keep those variables in the back of your mind. And then the Rajneesh case study, not a lot of attention now given to it because it was a few years ago and not many people, no one died. But that's an important vector that, let's just say WMD terrorism doesn't necessarily have to be associated with a terrorist group. That was more a cult or political group to execute their attack. And you saw the case study there. So week 5 preview, the readings, again, the Monar, EU, the PBS Frontline video goes with the Monar, the PBS Frontline on EU and counter terrorism. And I think it's excellent documentary on the recent attacks in France, or the Paris attacks, and how the EU failed to capture the Paris instigators. The Van Ever article, just go ahead. It's kind of bullet point in format. Just hit the high points on that. Don't really go too much in depth. And the Zakaria article is an excellent article. When we read the first week, in week 3, why do they hate us? This is probably the second part of that article. What I'd also say is this was all written before the rise of ISIS, so make sure that you kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And then the discussions, U.S. counterterrorism strategy. Again, we're looking for what's good and what's bad. And then Israeli counterterrorism strategy, what are the positives and negatives on that? So if there's any questions or issues, please let me know. And I look forward to this week's discussion.